They move in the corners of your vision. Tiny, black shadows, twisted and clawed. They slither from the cracks in the walls, creep through the slats in your closet, gather in the corners where the light doesn't reach. They're always watching, waiting. You might tell yourself it's just your mind playing tricks, but the truth is darker than you could ever imagine. Tiny, clawed hands twitch. Razor-sharp teeth chatter. They don't want your soul. They don't want your blood. They want your eyes. You might feel them watching, crawling closer when you blink. You might hear their faint, raspy whisper as they gurgle your name from the darkest parts of your room. By the time you feel their cold, bony fingers prying your eyelids apart, it's already too late. Welcome to another episode of Project Black Garden, a Monsters and Myths podcast. Season 1, The Oleander Files, Episode 7, File number 333, Them Devils. As always, I'm your host, Michael. And if you don't believe me, you soon will. I dare you. Close your eyes. See what happens. The curious thing about them devils is that their myth is so bizarre that they don't have an official name. These tiny, malevolent nightmares have been referred to by many different names. The Umbrax, meaning shadow. The Vantari, the darkest of the black. The Umbrith, the ancient evil born from shadows. The Dralvix, a sinister whispering presence. The Velmorn, a shadow that brings death and despair. The one thing they all have in common is every witness has referred to them in their physical form, most closely resembled miniature devils with sharp, tiny dagger fingers and toes, and 2 points on their evil heads that resemble devil horns. It is said that them devils can be brought forth by actions as simple as playing a few keys on an old piano, turning all the lights out at just the right time. Random stuff. But these stories all end the same. The longer you're aware of them, the more of them you see, the more they multiply. And they don't stop. It's said their main motivation is fear and their hunger for human eyes. And you would think they would only go after the most beautiful, the most rare eyes. For instance, green or hazel. But the scary truth is, no one is immune, because witnesses have suggested that these tiny little horrors prefer defects in the eyes, stigmatisms, cataracts. There's even a story that someone had stayed up longer than 72 hours and their eyes were almost completely red and bloodshot, and that triggered a deadly attack. Now, documented cases go as far back as 1975. At least 50 years of reports of small, shadowy creatures with clawed hands, jagged teeth, and an unholy hunger for human eyes. For instance, in 1975, in Kyoto, Japan, a university student reported experiencing sleep paralysis for weeks. Each time, he awoke to see dozens of tiny shadowy figures crawling from under his bed across the walls. They whispered in distorted voices, their eyes glowing faintly as they sang his name in the color of his eyes. One night, he felt their cold fingers on his face as they pried his eyelids open. He screamed, breaking the paralysis. When his roommate turned on the light, he was alone. But there were deep scratches covered all over his cheeks and eyelids. 1991, Brazil. A subway maintenance worker was inspecting a tunnel when his flashlight flickered. He saw dozens of small, skinny, hunched figures crawling along the walls and ceiling, their eyes glowing red. They seemed to whisper in an evil chorus, 3 words over and over again. Eyes for us. He dropped his light and ran. When he returned with security, nothing was there, except for hundreds of tiny scratches on the walls, shaped like hooven clawed hands. In a rural village, an entire family was found with their eyes missing, yet no blood was spilled. The local police dismissed it as a cult ritual, but the elder of the village claimed it was the work of shadow demons. He warned, these tiny devils steal vision and your soul. Villagers whispered that the creatures had returned from folklore, creeping into homes at night to pluck the eyes of the living and wear them as their own. In 2023, in Denver, Colorado, a teenage boy had invited over to his house for their very first date. Nervous at first, he thought he'd break the ice by playing a song he had learned on a family heirloom, an old grand piano. 10 bars into the first song, he noticed shadows from the corners of his eyes, moving in ways that led him to believe it wasn't natural. He ignored it at first, because the song had been a great icebreaker for the two of them. As his date eased her shyness, they became closer very quickly. But the more he played, the more shadows seemed to taunt him from the walls all over his living room. The attack came fast and swiftly as the two teenagers were overrun by what must have been thousands of tiny devils. When the police got there in the morning, they found tiny hand and footprints everywhere, thousands of them. They were dark red from the blood of both victims. Their faces were covered in scratches deep enough that you would have thought a knife had done it, and they were both missing their eyes. The police were shocked and dumbfounded because other than the bloody footprints, there was only one other piece of evidence. 3 words carved into the wall on one of the edges of the air conditioning vents. We see you. Now, I hesitated to include this episode in the podcast because there's not much history or evidence in my great uncle's journals about these creatures. He wrote of only one incident that he directly wasn't involved with. It was an incident my dad was a part of. And insanely, this incident involved me when I was 3 years old. So what I'm about to tell you is the story my father told his uncle about one horrible night that I thought I had created a bad dream that apparently was more real than I ever knew. And this is what my father told his uncle about that horrible night. I was barely 3 years old, and my parents and I had just recently moved to a small northern town in Texas. Now, my parents didn't have very much money at this time, so they had to make do with what they had, which turned out to be not much, as we moved all our things into a small square house. Now, it was 20 plus years older, but looked like it was vintage, at least 100 years. Now, these older houses used to be almost their own structure. You'd walk in, and it'd be an open room, probably a small living room. You could see the kitchen in the corner, and then a bathroom in one small master bedroom, and a door that led to the backyard. And that was pretty much it. Now, I remember moving in all our stuff, and I had this action figure. It was my favorite. It was a little robot. It was red and blue. He had yellow hands that if you pushed a button on his arm, would shoot off. Now, when I was a little kid, I thought those things shot 20 feet. In actuality, they probably only shot about 6 to 10 inches, but I loved it. And it's probably why I didn't notice when my father was stacking the different boxes in the corner of this little house. One particular box he placed on top of the others and went back out front to grab the next box. My mom was sweeping, attempting to clean what little she could, so we'd be able to sleep in semi-comfort that evening. But the box that he just sat down, I could have sworn I heard something scratching. As a little kid, whether it was my imagination, I don't know. I just remember thinking, that must be what it sounds like if you put a puppy in a box. The sound grew more intense, and I placed my little toy on the ground and walked up to the box. Now, for some reason, I remember reaching out to it, and just as I did, the lid began to slide upward as if it was opening from something inside. And you'd think that would have scared me off, but it didn't. Instead, I stepped closer, reaching up, and just before my fingertips touched the edge, my mother called to me and told me to get away from the boxes. I scooped up my toy, ran to her. She gave me a hug. Now, I don't remember anything else from the move. Everything else seemed normal. My dad seemed tired. We made a simple dinner that night, and I remember most of our canned goods hadn't been placed in the upper cupboard that was above the stove. There wasn't many, but there was enough to look like a small tin castle that led to the edge of one of the cabinet doors, almost like a little stairway. I remember thinking, man, my robot could climb that. It's perfect size for him. I remember my parents listening to the radio, me dancing to some cheesy music before falling extremely tired. But as the sun set and this little house became dark, I remember being nervous. Now, I wasn't scared of the dark, but I wasn't comfortable in it either. Eventually, my mom scooped me up and said, all right, let's get you washed up and get you ready for bed. As she picked me up, I could see over her shoulder as she walked me to the bathroom, already having the bath running water. And I remember seeing the cupboard door pull close just by a few inches. If it hadn't moved, I wouldn't have realized it was even open. But it closed. In the low light, I just assumed it was me seeing things. After my bath, my mother tucked me in and placed me on a small mattress that was on the floor on the edge of their small twin bed. My mother moved to the other side of the house and continued to unpack. I watched her for a few moments, my eyes closing back and forth as I eventually would fall asleep. But just before I did, I could have sworn I saw the cupboard in the kitchen slowly pop open again. And this time, there was movement. It was small and quick. It looked almost like a worm peeking out from the bottom of the cupboard door. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, and it was gone. So I rolled over and quickly fell asleep. Hours later, I woke up. I don't know why I did, but I did. My parents were in bed above me, and the house was dark, only lit by the moon's rays shining through the tiny window through the kitchen. Its beam of light reflected off the dingy, tiled floor. Instinctively, I reached underneath my pillow because that's where I kept my favorite toy, my awesome robot. But it wasn't there. Suddenly, from across the house, a small crash rang through the kitchen. It sounded like a piece of plastic falling to the floor. I sat up on my side and squinted my eyes, and in the middle of the kitchen floor was my toy robot. Its arms were pointed forward, and it was on its side, and it was missing both of its fists. Being a little kid, I just assumed maybe I left it there, even though now I can recall placing it back underneath my pillow before I went to sleep that night. Just then, the cupboard popped open, this time just enough for me to see inside of it. But it was so dark, all I could see was black. But inside that black were dozens of little red lights. At least I assumed they were lights at the time. Those lights started to move in pairs, and as I watched the first pair peek outside of that shadow, I realized they were eyes, tiny little slits that looked almost like glowing blood. And now, when I think about that night, I remember that those eyes were focused directly on me. Quickly, another pair of eyes peeked from those shadows, joining the first pair. And then another. And then finally, there were dozens of them. As I squinted harder in the dark to make out what I was seeing, the shape started to form around the first pair of eyes. I remember the shape not being any taller than my toy robot, maybe about 6 inches tall. It was all black and had a skinny torso with long, spindly legs and arms. The feet came to a pair of clawed toes. The hands looked like spiky knuckles with razor-sharp points for fingers. A small, pencil-thin neck, maybe an inch tall, and sitting on top of that, it looked like a rectangle with demon horns. I say now the best way to describe it is a guitar pick with 2 points on the ends, and centered in that were the 2 eyes. No other facial features. No nose, no mouth, just the eyes. But their shape told me that these were not nice eyes, that these were bad. And as the first little creature dangled from the cupboard with its spindly arms before falling onto the first can that was stacked on the counter, its little clawed feet making tiny little tappy noises, it looked right at me. Feeling the first wave of real fear, I pulled my little blanket over my head, covering my face, and I waited. What felt like an hour was probably only like 5 or 6 seconds. But when I pulled the blanket back down, the creature was still there in the same spot and hadn't moved. It took another step to the next can below it, finding its footing quickly. Its arm pointed directly at me, and its little head twitched and nodded. I pulled my blanket back up, but this time just enough for me to still peek over the top of it. I tried to call my mom, but nothing came out of my mouth. Suddenly, another one of the creatures jumped down to the can, and then another, and before you knew it, they were all spilling out. Like that old child's toy game, a barrel of monkeys. Some of them spun, some of them bounced, but as more and more poured out, they overflowed the counter, spilling into the sink. Their tiny claws clicking, scratching. I think about that sound now as I'm older, and it's the same sound you would hear if you were trying to wash or rinse your silverware. I rubbed up my eyes and sat up in bed, hoping that I was just dreaming. But when I opened back up, the first little creature was already in the middle of the floor, standing over my toy robot. Though I felt anger, I was frozen in fear. Behind this little creature, all his little evil colleagues seemed to jump and pounce and rain down from that cupboard and the counters, hitting the floors like little black droplets of licorice rain. I looked over at my parents and they were dead asleep. I started to shake the bed, pulling at my father's foot. Nothing. He didn't wake up. I tried to call out Dad, but nothing came out. From the kitchen came a long, lingering hiss. It sounded wet, almost like a cat in heat, but it had an echo to it. The sound has stayed with me all these years. For the longest time, I thought I made this up, this situation, these creatures, but I could never make up that sound, and I've never heard that sound ever since. Now my little fists found their way around my pillow as if I could use that as some kind of weapon. And the first tiny devil grabbed at my toy robot, placed it on its feet, pointed at me again, and with a flick of its sharp little claw, removed the robot's head and violently tossed it toward my mattress on the floor. It skipped across the floor, coming to a rest right in front of me. I picked it up, tightly holding it in a fist as I began to shake. And from the kitchen came 3 words. I see you. The devil said it again, this time accompanied by a couple of the other devils behind it. As they said it, all their eyes locked onto me. And then again, a chorus of it rang out. It echoed through the house, terrifying me. Immediately, I threw my blanket over my head again, one last ditch effort to protect myself. And that's when I heard them, all of them, running towards me, their little clawed feet clicking along the tile. It almost sounded like a hornet's nest or a beehive, and it got louder and louder until I couldn't take it anymore. And just when I was about to scream, the first one jumped on my blanket, and then the next, followed by the next. Their little claws digging into my blanket. I could hear it tear through the fabric, each one of them mumbling, I see you. You, I see. I tried to smack them off the blanket, but it was too late. Their little claws had dug in. I did everything I could to avoid being scratched or poked, but that didn't last very long. And when the first tiny hand reached the left cheek just below my eye, I was finally able to scream. I wailed as loud as I could, and it quickly turned into a moaning cry. I started kicking my feet, trying to punch at anything or anywhere that I felt touching that blanket. I kicked and I screamed and I cried, all while their clicks and their voices got louder in my head. And finally, when I couldn't take it anymore, the blanket was ripped from my head, out of my hands, and the lights were clicked on. My dad stood above me, holding the blanket, looking at me like I was crazy. My mom was at the light switch, petrified by my screaming. She looked at my dad and said, I think it was just a nightmare. My dad, annoyed, grumpy, tired, looked down at me, looked at the blanket, and then over his shoulder into the kitchen. There was nothing there. The cupboard door was closed. The only thing out of the ordinary was my tiny, headless toy in the middle of the kitchen. My father handed my blanket to my mom, stepped into the kitchen, picked up the toy, looked over at me, and said, Now, son, I know this toy's not worth much, but I expect you to respect the things that I buy you. Why did you tear its head off? And I looked down on my tiny mattress, and snugged between my legs as I was sitting up was the head of the toy. I looked at my dad and said, But I didn't do it. My mother looked at me and said, "Michael, don't lie to us. Why did you break your toy?" I hung my head in shame because I didn't know what to say. Needless to say, it was an early morning that next day. My mother made me breakfast quietly, disappointed, but ready to start a new day. As I sat down and took the first spoonful of cereal and put it in my mouth, my dad walked up, placed the robot on the table, and he said with a slight smile, "There, I fixed it." And there on my favorite toy, the robot's head, was reattached. My dad kneeled down, placed a hand on my head, and said, "Now let's take care of these toys a little better next time. Okay, Michael?" I just looked at my toy because it wasn't the same anymore. Something had changed, and it made me hate it immediately. But before I could respond to my father, he stood up, and with a half a laugh, he said, "And why did you scratch the eyes out of that thing? Weird." He grabbed his keys and left for the morning. I pushed the little toy away from me, turning it so I couldn't see its face, and ran outside and played until I couldn't remember what happened that night. Now, I vaguely remember playing with that toy once or twice after that, but it quickly became a relic and was either given away or thrown away. I'd have to ask my parents about that. And over the years, I really did think I imagined that. But one day, when I was about 25, my mom had packed up a box of some of my old belongings, the stuff that she liked to keep, first report cards, the first tooth I lost, my first pair of shoes, you know, all the classics. And in this box was that toy, and it had been wrapped in my old blanket that I'd used that night. And as I took a close look, the eyes of the robot really did look like I had taken a knife to him, or a small razor. But that wasn't the weirdest thing. The weirdest thing is that blanket, the one I used as my shield that night. It was tattered and ripped, almost like the top layer had been shredded, like someone took a dozen sharp forks to it. That was the first time I realized that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't my imagination. And when I read this entry in my great uncle's journal, and it was compared to the other stories that he had found and studied, I couldn't believe it. They were real. Those fucking devils were real. I guess I was lucky, because some of the other stories, people didn't fare too well. But I'm still not real comfortable at night in the kitchen with all the lights out. And now that I'm an adult, my cupboards are see-through. Now I'm curious, have any of my listeners, or anyone you know, have you seen them devils? And are you lucky, like I was, and I survived? All right, who's ready for another life update? This one's pretty significant. Any of you who've been following me on Twitter or Blue Sky know what's been going on. For those of you who haven't, you can find me at Gardner Michael on either one of the apps. I seem to be being stalked a lot more. I'm getting phone calls at all times of day, to where I've actually turned my phone off. My brother came over, and he witnessed some of this. And as good as it was to feel like somebody else was aware of my situation, and I knew I wasn't going crazy, my brother handles things in a certain way, and he loaned me his gun. Now, normally, I wouldn't tell you guys about that, because I'm sure plenty of you have your own protection, and I haven't had to use it. At least not yet. And I'm not sure if it makes me feel safe or more scared to have it with me. But 2 days later, there was an accident at his house, and my brother was shot in the leg while cleaning one of his guns. Now, if you know my brother, that doesn't happen. He's thorough and precise, but I thought that was a little more than coincidence. I've been scared to touch the handgun that he left me since. He's okay, embarrassed and confused by the incident, but he's good. Me, on the other hand, my nerves are shot. I'm not getting enough sleep. I'm making sure I find enough time to record each one of these episodes, but it is really taking a toll on me. So, stick with me, fellow gardeners, and I'll keep sharing with you these unbelievable files and their stories. I hope to see you guys next time when we tackle the history and stories of the mermaid. I'm Michael, and this is Project Black Garden, a Monsters and Myths podcast, Season 1, The Oleander Files. Remember, monsters are very real, even if you're young at heart.